Hello and welcome to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting. I'm Phil Emonson, and in this podcast series, we unpick some of the complexities, challenges and opportunities on the topic of climate resilience with some inspirational thought leaders. And today's episode is focused on assets, those structures, schemes and defences that keep us safe and protected. And to help me, I've got three great guests lined up, ready to give their insights. Richard Chubb and Alec Dane from JBA, and Claire Francis from the Environment Agency. So a really warm welcome to you all, and perhaps we could start with a round of introductions. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Well, first, as an introduction, first and foremost, I'm a chartered civil engineer, and for most of my career over the last 25 years, I've been working in flood and coastal erosion risk management, and amongst that, predominantly working with the Environment Agency. My current roles in JBA is that I lead our Eastern Resource Group, but I'm also JBA's framework manager for the Environment Agency's collaborative delivery framework, and we're working in the Southeast with the Environment Agency. Over to you, Claire.
Richard, I'm one of the flood and coastal risk managers with the Environment Agency. I've been with the organisation for 16 years and working in flood risk for the last 14. I have responsibility across Sussex, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, so a really beautiful and interesting part of the country. And my department covers, I guess, a wide range of flood and coastal risk management activities and centred on implementing our national flood and coastal risk management strategy in a local place. And Alec, over to you.
Hello everyone, my name's Alec Dane from JBA Consulting. I am a chartered civil engineer with 12 years experience, mainly in the field of coastal engineering. I've been involved in all stages of asset management life cycle, from inception and strategic studies right through to construction and on to asset management, inspection and maintenance. Been at JBA for 10 years now, worked in a predominantly environment agency and local authority type projects, but experience otherwise from network rail and private sector as well.
Lovely, thanks very much. So, some really great experiences on the panel today. So, to start then, let's begin by considering the fact that all of us working in this sector has a responsibility to keep people safe from the effects of our changing climate. Now, traditionally, the emergency services and indeed the EA were there to protect us. But as we have discussed on many other episodes of the podcast, agendas, strategies and policies are evolving, and there's now a much greater shared responsibility. In fact, in the last episode, we talked about the role that whole society have to play in being prepared. And so in that context, I'm really interested to hear where the current pressures are to both keep people safe by continuing to invest in our assets and maintaining them, whilst also building societal resilience. They aren't mutually exclusive, they go hand in hand. So I think this could be a really interesting discussion. Richard, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I think the good starting place for this is to look at what the pressure is on the system of flood and coastal erosion risk management assets. One of the biggest pressures that it faces is climate change and the impacts from climate change. So the greater number of events that are hitting the assets, this has impacts not only on our active assets, but those that are passive, embankments and walls, etc. They're under a growing pressure from a greater number of flood events. And this will lead to an accelerated degradation of those defences over time. So there is a sort of a speeding up of degrading assets, which is putting a greater pressure on the resources that we have to actually maintain those assets. And generally, this is creating a greater stress across the entire system. So coupled with that, we have got an aging asset base. A lot of our assets have been in place for decades. So there is a greater urgency to keep those assets in place and working as they should be, just from a sort of natural decay. And then we have all the other pressures from economic constraints. We have environmental constraints, considering where and how these assets have been assembled over the course of history. It was a very different world back then, and then we have different regulatory constraints that come on top of that. So the job has got progressively harder over time, just naturally in our evolution. But then we are facing now the impacts of climate change, which is just putting a greater pressure on what needs to get done to maintain the system. So it's just about trying to find the sustainable route forward in maintaining those assets, and thinking smarter, looking for holistic solutions, and that brings in, of course, the wider community in trying to build up resilient places and a resilient society for which those assets defend. So, I mean, it's just, in summary, that's sort of where this starts. I guess Claire might have some other insights from her role in the Environment Agency.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, Richard. I mean, a lot of what you said really succinctly kind of answers some of those big pressures. I think one of the things I just wanted to touch on, particularly coming back to your first point around climate change, is some of the data, I guess, from our recent National Flood Risk Assessment that the Environment Agency published earlier this year. And I think it really brings home that increase in pressure that we've got from the changing climate. And just some of the headline stats, just as a bit of a talking point. So the national assessment said that there's 6.3 million properties, that's homes and businesses, at risk from either rivers, the sea, or surface water flooding currently. And perhaps more worryingly, that with climate change, when we take that into account, we're expecting to see that figure potentially grow to 8 million by the middle of the century. And I guess the big headline for me, that's potentially 1 in 4 properties at risk of some form of flooding by the middle of the century. And I think that really starts to bring home for me and for kind of colleagues in the Environment Agency the scale of the challenge that we've got, and particularly when that comes to how do we continue to design either assets or resilience measures, and where does our focus need to start to shift to. And similarly, if you look at some of the infrastructure challenges, which I'm sure we'll come on to at some point in this conversation, but just over a third of our roads, railways, and kind of water infrastructure, so that's pumping stations, treatment plants, are currently at risk of flooding. And similarly with agricultural land, so some really important parts of our economy are, I guess, very relevant in terms of what we're talking about for what do we need to do and how do we need to think a little bit differently, as you say. Similarly, I'll also mention coastal erosion. As living on the south coast, that's always a pertinent thing that I want to bring into any conversation. And again, the National Coastal Erosion Risk Mapping was recently updated, and that says that 3,500 properties are currently at risk of coastal erosion up to 2025 and 2055. Sorry, and beyond that, if we take into account climate change, we'd expect that to increase to over 10,000. So there really are some huge pressures that just our natural environment is going to create for us, and what we've always done might not be the same. It might not be good enough going forward. So we really do need to start thinking now at the kind of the long-term planning, and how do we build that kind of capacity and sustainability into our approaches. And I'm really pleased you said around holistic management, because that is really kind of a key thing for us, whether we talk about water as a whole. So I focus on flooding. That's what my day-to-day work is, but flooding doesn't happen in isolation. So if we look at water, we're looking at water resources, water scarcity, water quality, and flooding where we've got too much water. So the real challenge for me is how do we think about our assets and our approaches as a whole? How do we really bring that together for a much more sustainable way of managing kind of what we're seeing in terms of the climate and some of those other challenges around economy? How do we invest in our assets in the right places? That's not necessarily the assets that we've currently got. That's not necessarily the assets operating in the way that we have always operated them. And then that resilience piece for me is absolutely key, and hopefully we'll get to spend a little bit more time today touching on that. But there are various interventions that help us manage flood and coastal erosion risk, as well as some of the other pressures from a changing climate. And we really need to think about how do we use those in combination and not rely on, I guess, some of the practices and then the notion of defence and protection that we've always done. But it's around resilience and how do we live and work differently with the climate that we're seeing. So that's probably some initial thoughts from me, and I'll Alec come in.
Thanks, Claire. I think a couple of pressures that probably haven't been touched on in those two really interesting insights there are in relation to the kind of public perception pressure and investment and funding pressures. So the two are no doubt interlinked and come hand in hand. I think if we look at how we have engaged over the last 10 years, we've very much kind of been on a journey. We started the process of engaging with communities, and it was always a battle of, climate change is coming, it is real, sea level rise is happening, and you'd spend, a good 50% of your engagement events just trying to convince people that climate change was something we need to consider. As we go out now, we're not spending any time on that. There is a public perception and public acceptance that climate change and sea level rise is happening. And with that, there's a big benefits in flood risk management, because to some extent we're pushing at an open door now that we need to change, that we need to invest in our assets and things like that. But the negative side of that is that really now there's a lot more public opinion and public weight behind us needing to invest and maintain our assets. So a lot of the engagement we do around asset management and asset investment now is actually a little bit more on the education that we don't have to maintain all of our assets. We don't have to invest in flood risk management infrastructure. We can invest in that when there is an economic, a financial, and an environmental case for us to do that. And that's a really tough message to get across to communities who sit behind often these flood defences and assume that they will be continued to maintained in the future, when in reality, the funding environment we sit in now, a lot of these areas are not kind of strong business cases to continue to invest in under current funding and infrastructure rules. So definitely that public perception part of it is a real challenge for how we go about asset management and maintenance now. And linked to that is the funding elements. I think it's fair to say historically, there has been more investment into capital infrastructure than there has been into operational infrastructure and management and maintenance of assets. And that does tend to lead to declining condition over time. As Richard said, we have an aging asset base. We have more assets than ever before in declining or poor condition. And that is a real challenge from an investment point of view. So that funding and investment into our existing assets at the moment is going to need to considerably increase over the future. And if I can just touch on one final pressure I consider at the moment, or challenge, is technological. And that is that the tools and techniques that we have available to help us in asset management are to some extent out of date. They need updating, they need reconsidering. If we look at how we assess the condition of our assets, it's done on a very subjective, qualitative assessment on a 1 to 5 basis. It's a relatively coarse way of us scoring our asset base. And the effect of that is for us to have large numbers of assets, all within condition grade 3 or fair. And that's really hard for us to then monitor how those assets are performing over time and changing over time. And the effect of that is we've got a large amount of assets that are soon going to be dropping out of this condition grade into the poor, where risks start getting much more significant. And coupled with that is our ability to predict when assets will fail or are likely to fail. We have tools to predict the deterioration over time, but they are relatively limited in their application. They consider material degradation really well, but they don't necessarily capture the kind of episodic failure that we might see with more the flood risk management infrastructure we manage. And so there is a need for those to be updated for sure to kind of capture those things. And perhaps the biggest limitation with those tools is the fact that they don't consider climate change. It is a relatively static deterioration over time without that increase in forcing from climate change. So what Claire and Richard touched upon there, I think, is really important, is what has got us to this point in terms of protecting communities, reducing risks to communities, isn't what will get us to the same level in the future. We need to think differently around flood risk management, asset management, because the work that we've done to date won't continue to work in the future.
Thanks, Alec. And that's a really helpful way, I suppose, to conclude that first part of the conversation. you've each individually then touched on a lot of these challenges that we're facing and pressures around climate change, public perception, technology, funding and investment. And I suppose from my perspective, the objective in terms of investment for those who are making investment decisions for the long-term security and sustainability and resilience of the country is to invest in the right thing at the right place at the right time. And with climate change, there will be a need to consider and adopt different investment choices. I suppose as we can adjust the framing of our investment approach to a more sustainable and progressive model, and that might have the potential to deliver better value for the public purse in terms of benefits to people and place, and to deliver better regional and national outcomes over the next 25 to 50 years, considering, Claire, what you were saying about what the likely levels of risk exposure are likely to be in the middle part of the century. So to move that conversation on then, having identified what are a lot of current pressures, and you've all spoke quite eloquently about how things are evolving, what do each of you think then is the biggest shift that we need to see perhaps in the next 10 years in respect of asset management and building resilience? And it could be related, I suppose, to some of those pressures that we spoke about in terms of engagement or policy, funding and finance. Alec, I might come to you first on this one.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, and I'll probably pick up where I left off, which is that I think we need to see a big shift in terms of the technological improvements, technological tools we have to manage our asset base. I think we need to, move away from these relatively coarse subjective condition scores. We need to be looking at more real-time monitoring, real-time feedback to understand the condition of those assets over time, and constantly feeding that back into our ability to predict their deterioration over time. I know there are pieces that were underway in the Environment Agency research and development pieces to update a number of these tools, and really welcome to see those coming forward. But that we really need that to be able to move towards more of a whole life cost model and to understand better the value for money investing in our flood defences, to be able to more accurately predict when our flood risk management infrastructure is going to fail under a range of different scenarios. Links really nicely in with adaptation planning and the adaptation pathways approach that does come through the National Flood and Erosion Risk Management Strategy, which is we should also be looking at our asset management and maintenance on adaptation pathway type approaches. That's to say, if funding investment assumes X, how does that result in the kind of condition of our assets deteriorating over time? If climate change and sea level rise or river runoff, increases by Y, how would that affect our asset base? And building that adaptation pathways approach into our asset management and our asset investment decision making be really powerful to capture those significant uncertainties we've got when making decisions on these investments.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alec. Richard, maybe we'll come over to you next.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And technology has certainly helped and made advances in our understanding, and it also makes links to it makes links with other sources of information and data from other bodies that are involved in this, because the solutions and the shift does need to be to holistic and a fully sort of combined effort from lots of agencies, the communities and the private sector, etc. So I think technology is helping provide the data to enable decisions to be made which have combined outcomes and are basically smarter in their holistic approach. So not only just looking at sort of the developments around understanding the physical deterioration of assets and making decisions around that, but where we can bring in other sources of data to help us make a much better and more informed decision. I think that's a definite shift in the right direction, which I think has started to happen and certainly over the next 10 years. That's absolutely important that we do that. I think funding is, certainly when you look at the next 10 years, I think, and there already is an acceptance, I think that money needs to move from, your capital investments to sort of new assets or overall new improvements to funding or better funding for our operational and maintenance activities of the assets. So that shift and that reinvestment in the existing asset base that is doing a huge important job and currently protecting the numbers of houses that Claire was mentioning earlier. So that move I think is going to shift, and I think it's absolutely imperative to get on top of the pressure that we have on the assets at the moment, and then moving towards a TOTEX model, which I think, Phil, you mentioned earlier that you had some insights into a TOTEX model in one of the projects you've been working on.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Yeah, so we're starting to explore whether different investment arrangements would be more beneficial, and what shifts we can make to investment planning that would provide betterment in terms of some of the decision making and options available. And actually, there is this sort of question around whether moving to a TOTEX type expenditure model for asset management would be more beneficial. TOTEX being that actually you invest by adopting a whole system costing model that integrates capital and operational budgets, compared to perhaps the sort of capex type approach that Alec, you referred to earlier. So yes, we are involved in some pieces of work where this is actually on the table, and we're starting to look at, well, what evidence and what sort of case studies exist that we can draw on where these have been applied, and is there substantive narrative that can be put together to actually evidence that moving to a TOTEX, total expenditure approach, to investment planning would be more beneficial. So yes, these types of shifts in our investment decision making, I think, are really important. And for me, I think one of the other investment shifts that I'd like to see, and I think is really important, is that currently our investment is predominantly driven by risk management, whereas actually we would like to see, and probably do need to see as a society, a rebalancing of that, bearing in mind the importance of investing in risk management, but also to invest proportionately in resilience and the actions that can improve resilience. So warning and informing, emergency planning, response and recovery. So these other components that exist, as well as the protect and the maintain, that will actually contribute to that whole society resilience piece. And we've touched on that in other episodes of the podcast as well. So there are definitely some shifts, as you say, Richard, in terms of the investment landscape that will be really helpful to see over the next 10 years. Claire, I might give the final word to you on this point. What are some of the shifts and big shifts that you think are important and you'd like to see in respect of assets and resilience?
Thanks, Phil, and really interesting to hear Alec and Richard's and your own thoughts, particularly around the asset management space. And I completely agree that the investment piece and how things are changing and how we're starting to think differently is definitely recognised as kind of one of the key things, I guess, across the sector that will help us move forward. But I guess for me personally, if I think about some of the bigger shifts, and it's kind of to lift us up out of pure asset management, and it's mainstreaming resilience and adaptation. And I think we've all used those words in different ways across this conversation, but really understanding that how we manage risk, how we manage the impact of a changing climate, the changing coast on our kind of communities and places, is not just going to be about asset management going forward. That will clearly has been and will continue to be a really important part of flood risk and coastal risk management. But I don't think it can be the whole solution, and we need to start looking at those things much more in combination. So again, pointing back to the National SUM strategy and just thinking of its vision statement, which is a nation ready for and resilient to flooding and coastal change, today, tomorrow, into the year 2100. We really need to start future-proofing some of our kind of decision-making, some of our planning, and thinking about how do we do that, taking into account the challenges that we know we've got and the role that actually a lot of people need to play in that. That's not just one organisation can't make a place resilient. That's kind of public organisations, private organisations, businesses, communities, local places, local government. There's plenty of kind of work needing to be done to bring all of those strands together. So you mentioned some of those forms of resilience, Phil, and thinking about warning and forming. How do we increase the reach? How do we increase the understanding? How do we make that data more accessible? And there's been some really great things that have done. There's a lot more information out there now around kind of flood risk, what's happening with water levels. Gov.uk is a great place to find some of that information. And it's really, I guess, opening up that conversation so we're all much more comfortable talking about what flood risk means. How do we live with some of those changes? How do we adapt to what might be coming in the future? And how do we think a little bit differently around it? And again, that's how do we prepare for what's coming? How do we minimize the impact? So when flooding does happen, and as some of the data we've talked about, it shows it will keep happening and it will increasingly happen. So how do we make the impact of that less? And how do we recover quicker? So some of the kind of the phrases we use around building back better. How do we learn from what's gone before, and how do we enhance our ability to adapt to when it comes again? And again, we've talked about adaptation, and I think Alec mentioned adaptation strategies, particularly in some of the kind of innovation that the sector is doing around that. And that's not necessarily delivering a solution or an asset now that will be fit for purpose for 100 years, which is probably the more traditional way that we've talked about protection and flood defences. But how do we understand what is appropriate and proportionate now? That helps with that investment conversation. But also at what point, and how do we understand what might need to change in the future, and how do we design some of those approaches? How do we increase education, awareness, the ability for the wider society to get involved in flood risk management? How do we bring other voices into the conversation? So this isn't just, I guess, infrastructure delivery at its core. This is around how people respond to climate change. How do our environment and communities kind of work together to understand what that looks like? And there's some really exciting research happening in that space. We've certainly got the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Programme, which is delivering some great projects at the moment to try and test some of those theories and to develop that learning so we can embed that more widely. And that it's around just, I guess, accepting change and taking the opportunities that's also going to bring for us. So yeah, for me, asset management is really important, but we need to put some of those other aspects with it too, because we won't get there, I think, unless we do it together.
Thanks. And Richard, I was going to say, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I some really excellent insights, Claire. And I think one of the things that you mentioned a number of times, and I think is so important, and the other podcasts have definitely covered this, but community engagement and getting the message out there, a clear message, I suppose, around what the issues are, what our choices are, and what our approach is to solving them. And it goes way beyond asset management. It needs to be a fully integrated policy. So making that clear. And then ultimately, it comes down to some difficult decisions that need to be made at the right time, need to be communicated, engaged upon at the right time. But ultimately, giving a clear plan of how we move forward to create more resilience across our asset base and the communities that are being protected by it, and all the services that go in between. So, yeah, it does come back to engagement and communication, getting that absolutely right. That's going to be so important in the next 10, 20 years as we start to have to make some, as we have been doing, but more so, some key decisions and show the pathway forward clearly. So yeah, just wanted to sort of bring that back to in what Claire just rung a bell with what Claire was saying to me.
Yeah. Thanks, Richard. And Claire, you used the phrase mainstreaming resilience, and I think that's a great sort of place to end, really, because resilience isn't and shouldn't be a synonym for what we have done before. things are changing. There is a case for change, and that's in the language and the engagement that we undertake, as you alluded to, Richard, but also how we integrate across our various disciplines. And Claire, you mentioned and referenced the EA's vision for a nation ready for and resilient to climate change, and delivery of that isn't just about the number of properties protected alone. Obviously, protecting properties is really important, but it's also about schemes and projects that deliver better and more integrated outcomes, and outcomes that allow the whole of society then to be more aware of their risk and able to adapt and have the capacity and to respond and recover more effectively in time. So yeah, that's, I think, where we're headed. But that's been a great conversation. Thanks, Alec. Thanks, Richard, and Claire as well, for your insights and contributions today. It's been fantastic. So we have reached the end of our time today. As always, if you've enjoyed listening, then please hit the subscribe button so you're ready for the next episode in a month's time. Till then, thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Emonson, and you've been listening to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting.